Well, yes, I'm delighted to be here and talk about income inequality. And tonight I will be giving a talk on the relationship between inequality and higher education, which is a very contentious subject. And I'm going to sort of try to be as judicious as I can in parsing the arguments of both sides, because it has become a not exactly partisan debate, but a debate between two warring factions. And I actually think the story is complicated. I think higher education has played a role in income inequality. It can also be a path out of income inequality, a partial path, I should say. But I'll get into all of those questions later tonight. Today, I was asked to read an excerpt from my book, and my book is extremely difficult to excerpt because it's really written as a primer. But when I was working at the New Republic, the editor there, Richard Just, did a really terrific job of excerpting the book by moving some parts around. And so I am going to follow his lead and read this cover story that ran in the New Republic as an excerpt from my book. And I should say it's all from the book. It's just that the paragraphs are moved around a little bit in a way that makes it easier to excerpt. And if you'll just give me a moment while I access it. Sorry, I should have had this all queued up already. I'm going to my state-of-the-art website. I'm very, very proud of my website, which I designed myself, causing me briefly to consider changing careers and becoming an art director. Let's see. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and read this excerpt, which is not too long. The title of the book. The title of the book is The Great Divergence, America's Growing Inequality Crisis and What We Can Do About It. It was published in 2012 by Bloomsbury. And this is an excerpt that ran a few months before publication in the New Republic magazine, where I was then a senior editor. When Americans express indifference about the problem of unequal incomes, it's usually because they see the United States as a land of boundless opportunity. Sure, you'll hear it said, our country has pretty big income disparities compared with Western Europe. And sure, those disparities have been widening in recent decades. But stark economic inequality is the price we pay for living in a dynamic economy with avenues to advancement that the class-bound old world can only dream about. We may have less equality of economic outcomes, but we have a lot more equality of economic opportunity. The problem is that this isn't true. Most of Western Europe today is both more equal in incomes and more economically mobile than the United States. And it isn't just Western Europe. Countries as varied as Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, and Pakistan all have higher degrees of income mobility than we do. A nation that prides itself on its lack of class rigidity has, in short, become significantly more economically rigid than many other developed countries. How did our perception of ourselves end up so far out of sync with reality? In the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that in notable contrast to the, quote, aristocratic nations, unquote, of Europe, the United States was a place where, quote, new families are constantly springing up, others are constantly falling away, and all that remain change their condition, unquote. Karl Marx sounded a similar note in 1865 when he observed that, quote, the position of wages laborer is for a very large part of the American people but a probational state, which they are sure to leave within a longer or shorter term. But it was two American writers who probably did more to shape our country's self-image as the land of but it was two American writers who probably did the most to shape our country's self-image as the land of unbounded opportunity. They were Horatio Alger, of whom you've probably heard, and James Truslow Adams, of whom you probably haven't. When Alger and Adams were alive, and also for that matter when Tocqueville and Marx contributed their observations, American opportunity was a much closer match to their superlatives than it is today. Alger wrote Ragged Dick, 1868, Luck and Pluck, 1869, and other dime novels for boys about getting ahead through virtue and hard work. To call these books popular would be an understatement. Fully 5% of all the books checked out of the Muncie, Indiana Public Library between November 1891 and December 1902 were authored by Alger. Adams was a more cerebral fellow who wrote books of American history. His influence stems from the fact that one of these books, The Epic of America, published in 1931, introduced the phrase, quote, "the American dream," unquote, to our national discourse. Writing at the start of the Great Depression, Adams envisioned not, quote, "a dream of motor cars and high wages merely," unquote, but rather, quote, "a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position," unquote. Born half a century apart, neither Alger nor Adams could claim to have risen from the bottom. Both came from well-established families whose American roots dated to the early 17th century. Alger could trace his lineage to three pilgrims who in 1621 sailed to Plymouth Plantation on the Fortune, the second English ship to arrive there. Adams, no relation to the presidential Adamses, was descended from a man who arrived in Maryland in 1838 as an indentured servant and within 3 years possessed 185 acres. Alger's father was a Unitarian minister, Adams's a stockbroker. Both fathers were men of good breeding and education who struggled to make ends meet but were able, at a time when more than 90% of the population didn't finish high school, to obtain higher education for their sons. Alger went to Harvard, Adams went to Brooklyn Polytechnic, and briefly Yale. Both sons followed their fathers into the ministry and finance, respectively, before they became full-time writers. Each author was, in his own way, highly successful, but the upward trajectory of these two literary careers would make poor material for a Horatio Alger tale. The circumstances of Alger's job change are especially problematic. At 34, he vacated the pulpit abruptly when he was charged with, quote, "the abominable and revolting crime of unnatural familiarity with boys," unquote. Alger did not dispute the accusation, which was based on the testimony of two teenage boys in his parish, ages 13 and 15, who said Alger had molested them and on rumors that he'd abused other youths in similar fashion. After confessing his guilt privately to William James, the founding father of American psychology, Alger never spoke of it again. Adams left Wall Street under less lurid circumstances. He simply disliked the work and resolved to stop once he amassed $100,000. Reviewing his accounts on his 35th birthday, he concluded that he'd achieved his goal, the equivalent of about $2 million in current dollars, and resigned the following day. Adams spent much of his subsequent life abroad and wrote The Epic of America in London. Alger and Adams celebrated America's capacity for upward mobility, but neither writer idealized his country to anything like the extent that would later be credited to the name Horatio Alger and to the phrase the American dream. Alger worked into his later juvenile fiction much moralizing against the robber barons' self-dealing and cruel treatment of the downtrodden. Quote, "he has done more harm than he can ever repair," unquote. A character in Alger's 1889 novel, Luke Walton, laments about a villain modeled on the Gilded Age stock manipulator Jay Gould. Adams deplored America's tendency to celebrate, quote, "business and money-making and material improvement as good in themselves," unquote, and its refusal, quote, "to look on the seamy and sordid realities of any situation in which we find ourselves." He even complained about America's maldistribution of wealth. Still, neither writer had much taste for radical politics. Alger was essentially a mugwump, a good government Republican, distrustful of machine politics and free silver populism. Adams was a Tory-minded political independent who became a severe critic of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which he deemed financially irresponsible. Both men bequeathed to the United States an exaggerated notion of itself as a mobile society because they lived during the peak years of American mobility, the latter half of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, when the American Industrial Revolution was wreaking maximum creative destruction on what had previously been an agrarian economy. The best way to measure mobility is to calculate the economic position of an individual relative to the rest of society and compare that with the economic position of that person's child relative to the rest of society once that child has grown to a comparable stage in life. To calculate mobility for a society as a whole, you therefore need income data over 2 generations for a large sample of American families. The government, alas, didn't collect income data during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the Census Bureau did collect data on occupations which can serve as a rough proxy. In a 2005 paper, Joseph Ferry, an economic professor at Northwestern, not too far from here, studied census records about the occupations of fathers and sons between 1850, the year Alger turned 18, and 1920, 21 years after Alger's death, and the year Adams turned 42. Ferry then compared these records with father-son data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics during the second half of the 20th century. He divided everyone into 4 categories: unskilled worker, farmer, skilled or semi-skilled worker, and white-collar worker. To keep both data sets consistent, he limited his inquiry to white native-born males. Ferry also made some technical adjustments to allow for the different occupational structures of the 2 eras. What he found was that the equivalent of 41% of farmers' sons advanced to white-collar jobs between 1880 and 1900, compared with 32% between 1950 and 1973. Ferry's conclusion held up when he looked at all 4 job categories and when he compared other stretches of the late 19th century with other stretches of the late 20th. Between the horse and buggy days and the interstate highway era, American society had become significantly less mobile. These findings are all the more striking because the 1950s and 60s were a period, the last period in the United States, it turned out, when intergenerational mobility was increasing. The economy was booming, and men born during the Great Depression and World War II were enjoying opportunities that their fathers could scarcely imagine. Even so, mobility in this post-war era was no match for the mobility enjoyed by the generations of workers who lived during Alger's lifetime and James Adams's youth and early adulthood. Adams wrote in the Epic of America that the dream of living, quote, unhampered by the barriers which had slowly been erected in older civilizations, unquote, was, quote, realized more fully in actual life in the United States than anywhere else, unquote. Was this a fantasy? Probably not at the time Adams was writing. Ferry and Jason Long, an associate professor of economics at Colby College, looked at mobility during the late 19th century in both the United States and Great Britain. At that time, England was still the richest industrial country in the world, but it offered nothing like the opportunities for economic advancement that were available in its former colony. In Britain, for example, 53% of the sons of unskilled laborers moved up to skilled and semi-skilled labor or better. In the United States, fully 81% did. This was an era when the loftiest rhetoric about the United States as the land of opportunity rang true. As recently as 1987, economists could still be heard vouching for American mobility. In a speech that year to the American Economic Association, the University of Chicago economist Gary Becker, a future Nobel laureate, said, quote, in every country with data that I have seen, low earnings as well as high earnings are not strongly transmitted from fathers to sons. 5 years later, Gary Solon, an economist at the University of Michigan, would blow Becker's assertion to smithereens, at least as it applied to the United States. To measure economic mobility effectively, you need access to good longitudinal data on families and income. Until fairly recently, the pickings were slim. But by 1992, the University of Michigan's Panel Study of Income Dynamics, PSID, a longitudinal study of more than 9,000 families from across the United States, had reached its 24-year mark and ripened into an unmatched source for detailed information on 2 successive American generations. Now old enough to include data on 3 or 4 generations, the PSID is the world's longest-running, quote, panel survey, unquote, of nationally representative households. A panel survey is a longitudinal study in which respondents are interviewed at regular intervals. Most contemporary studies of mobility trends in the United States make use of PSID data. Sahlins' groundbreaking 1992 paper, which drew on this newly available data, upended our understanding of something that economists call, quote, intergenerational income elasticity, unquote, but that I will call, for the layperson, quote, income heritability, unquote. It's a measure of how determinative one generation's relative income status, what we used to call station in life, will be the next generation's relative income status. When Becker stated in 1987 that income status wasn't especially heritable, he was working off studies that showed income heritability to be less than 20%, which didn't seem too bad. 80% of your economic destiny was in your hands, or at least out of your parents' hands. Perhaps you're familiar with the following lines from William Ernest Henley's Invictus, an oft-quoted inspirational poem from the 19th century. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. In 1987, it was possible for Americans to believe, with respect to income, I am the master of 80% of my fate. I am the captain of 80% of my soul. But in 1992, when Sahlin recalculated income heritability based on the more reliable PSID data, he found income heritability to be at least 40% and possibly higher. I am the master of 60% of my fate. Or possibly, I am the master of 40 to 50% of my fate. In 2001, Bhaskar Mazumdar, an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and I must say, as I'm reading this, I'm struck by how much of the information we have about this subject comes from the Midwest, recalculated income heritability matching census data to Social Security data, which allowed him to compare parent-child incomes over a greater number of years. He found that income heritability was more like 50 to 60%. Mazumdar later recalculated Sahlin's PSID-based findings, applying a more sophisticated statistical model, and found that income heritability was about 60%. Then, in a 2004 study, Mazumdar approached the question from a different angle, examining the correlation in incomes among siblings using longitudinal survey data collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That put income heritability at about 50%. Quote, the sibling correlation in economic outcomes and human capital are larger than the sibling correlation in a variety of other outcomes, including some measures of physical attributes, unquote, Mazumdar wrote. Most strikingly, he found that income among brothers actually correlated more closely than height and weight. I'm going to read that again because it's such an amazing fact. Most strikingly, Mazumdar found that income among brothers actually correlated more closely than height and weight. I am less the master of my fate than I am of my body mass index. It's important to remember that the mobility trend for Americans as a whole is not necessarily a trend for every U.S. subgroup. For instance, upward mobility for women has accelerated in recent decades. The trend can be hard to track in intergenerational family income data because while a contemporary woman will likely out-earn her mother, who lived at a time when society provided far fewer economic opportunities to women, she won't likely out-earn her father, who faced no gender barriers at all. At the same time, upward mobility for African Americans has lagged behind upward mobility for whites. One especially disturbing 2008 analysis by the Brookings Institution's Julia Isaacs compared PSID income data from parents in the late 60s with PSID income data from their children in the late 90s. Isaacs found that only 31% of black children born into the middle fifth of family incomes, dead center of the middle class, where incomes in 2006 dollars range from about $49,000 to $65,000, only 31% ended up with higher incomes than their parents did, corrected for inflation. Fully 45% fell all the way to the bottom income fifth, below about $40,000. By comparison, 68% of whites born in the middle income fifth ended up with incomes higher than their parents had, and only 16% tumbled all the way down to the bottom income fifth, where these white parents mostly saw their children better off economically than they had been. Corresponding, black parents mostly saw their children become worse off. In the United States, economic mobility is lower than it was during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is no longer accelerating as it was during the 50s and 60s. And it is about the same as it was in 1970. Meanwhile, mobility in the United States has fallen dramatically behind mobility in other comparably developed democracies. A 2007 study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, combined a number of previous estimates and found income heritability to be greater in the United States than in Denmark, Australia, Norway, Finland, Canada, Sweden, Germany, Spain, and France. Italy was a bit less mobile than the United States. The United Kingdom, which had been far less mobile than the United States during the late 19th century, brought up the rear, but this time it was just a little bit less mobile than the United States. The OECD's ranking was based on a somewhat conservative U.S. estimate of 47% income heritability. Mazumdar of the Chicago Fed puts it at 50 to 60%, which would rank the United States either tied with the United Kingdom for last place or dead last after the United Kingdom. Thanks to a 2012 recalculation by Miles Korak, an economist at the University of Ottawa, we can now add Switzerland, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore, and Pakistan to the list of societies that are more mobile than the United States. Italy and the United Kingdom were once again found to be less mobile than the United States, along with Chile, Brazil, Peru, and China. It's especially striking that Canada should experience more intergenerational economic mobility than the United States. The two countries are, after all, similar in more ways than one can count. The most significant way they differ, at least for the purposes of this discussion, is that the United States is richer with a per capita gross domestic product that's 20% higher. Most migration between the two is from Canada to the United States, not the other way around. How can Canada be the land of greater opportunity? The University of Ottawa's Korak looked at this puzzle in a 2010 paper, examining several existing mobility studies, quote, using particularly high-quality data, unquote. Korak found that Canada is, quote, up to 3 times more mobile than the United States, unquote. The difference arises largely from disparities at the top and the bottom 10% of the income scale. If a father is in the bottom 10th of U.S. incomes, Korak found, his son has a 22% likelihood of ending up in the bottom 10th. If a father is in Canada's bottom 10th, his son's likelihood of ending up in the bottom 10th is 16%. At the other end of the income scale, if a father is in the top 10th of U.S. incomes, his son had a 26% chance of ending up in the top 10th. If a father is in Canada's top income 10th, his son's likelihood of ending up in the top 10th is 18%. A crowning irony is that even though Canada is demonstrably more economically mobile than the United States, Americans are less likely to believe that their chance of financial success depends on their parents' incomes, 42%, than are Canadians, 57%, according to a 2009 poll sponsored by the Pew Charitable Trusts. Indeed, when a survey of 27 nations conducted from 1998 to 2001 asked participants whether they believed that, quote, people are rewarded for intelligence and skill, unquote, the country with the highest proportion answering in the affirmative was the United States, 69%, compared with a median among all other countries of about 40%. Similarly, more than 60% of Americans agreed that, quote, people get rewarded for their effort, unquote, compared with an international median of less than 40%. When participants were asked whether coming from a wealthy family was, quote, essential, unquote, or, quote, very important, unquote, to getting ahead, the percentage of American affirmatives was much lower than the international median, 19% versus 28%. Perhaps there is a benefit to lacking a realistic understanding about your odds of improving your relative position in society. It is, James Fallows argues in his 1989 book, More Like Us, Making America Great Again, a major driver of the U.S. economy. Paraphrasing the Harvard psychologist David McClelland's 1961 book, The Achieving Society, Fallows writes that a society in which, quote, people routinely overestimated their chances for success, unquote, in which entrepreneurs, quote, launched ventures that by rational standards were likely to fail, unquote, was a society that collectively and over the long term would invent more, innovate more, and succeed more. Society benefits when people don't know, quote, their place, unquote. A more jaundiced view of America's obdurate belief that we are all masters of our fate is expressed in Barbara Ehrenreich's 2009 book, Bright-Sided: how the relentless promotion of positive thinking has undermined America. What if you don't achieve your most unrealistic goals, as most of us, let's face it, won't? Always, Ehrenreich writes, quote, in a hissed undertone, there is the darker message that if you don't have all that you want, if you feel sick, discouraged, or defeated, you have only yourself to blame, unquote. The American reluctance to regard disappointing outcomes as anything other than failed personal agency, Ehrenreich argues, is not only painful to the spirit, it is also an obstacle to constructive forms of collective action, such as forming a labor union or organizing a political movement. And I'll stop there.
Interesting. Very well. Thank you. Do I need to refresh your coffee or?
No, I think I'm going to have just a little bit of
Stick
water.
with water?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Question? Please. Go ahead. I can see your smile. Yeah.
If your question is why do all the local chambers of commerce throughout America that give out Horatio Alger awards, why are they unfamiliar with Horatio Alger's dodgy personal history? My answer would be I have no idea. Not that it's necessarily relevant, but still.
Thank you for the reading. I'm really excited about reading your book. I have only gotten through the beginning, and this has recently become like a very interesting topic that I'm looking into. I recently took last semester. Was it last semester? Oh my goodness. Dr. Trent's education and stratification course, and so a lot of the data and statistics that you talked about are some of the things that we cover in the course. And I'm very I'm particularly interested in the disadvantaged class of individuals with disabilities, and I think I wrote a little bit about this during my coursework there in the class, and I'm just really interested in your views and thoughts regarding individuals with disabilities as a disadvantaged class in as far as income, looking at statistics or income mobility and things of that nature. I know one of the things that I was looking at in the course was trying to look at stratification literature and literature related to inequality, and I noticed that a lot of the literature really didn't focus on individuals with disability, but if you look at their plight and the disability movement and things of that nature, it's sort of similar to some of the and it was actually similar and grounded on the civil rights movement and some other things. And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts related to individuals with disability and their income mobility.
Yes, the reason I'm looking here is I want to just kind of read another section of the book to answer your question. I think that'll be the simplest way to do it.
And my voice is gone, excuse me.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, when I'm talking about income inequality, which actually I wasn't in that chapter so much as sort of opportunity, with mobility, slightly different idea, but when I talk about income inequality, I'm interested in a particular thing, which is the growth society-wide in income inequality since 1979 to today. It's been steadily growing. For half a century before that, it was either shrinking or remaining stable. So it's a change from the historic pattern that prevailed for much of the 20th century. But inevitably the question arises, well, what about these other forms of inequality? And I discuss that here in the intro of my book. Let me read this to just sort of kind of try to put it all in context. We tend to think of the United States as a place that has grown more equal over time, not less. And in the most obvious ways, that's true. When the Republic was founded, African Americans were still held in bondage and were defined in the Constitution as representing 3/5 of a human being. Only adult white male property owners could vote. Over the next 2 centuries, full citizenship rights were extended gradually to people who didn't own property, to blacks, to women, and to Native Americans. In recent years, gay activists have fought at the state level for the right to same-sex marriage, and they prevailed at this writing in 6 states and in the District of Columbia. It seems just a matter of time before this right is extended in the rest of the country, and those stats, I'm sure, are already out of date since this book was published 2 years ago. And I would put in the category of situation of the disabled. They have clearly acquired sort of, more rights today relative to what they enjoyed during what I'm looking back in this book as the golden age. It was not the golden age for minorities. It was the golden age only for the white middle class majority. You could even qualify that more by saying the white middle class majority that was heterosexual and not of draft age. All the groups mentioned here experienced setbacks in their pursuit of legal equality, some lasting as long as a century. Few people belonging to any of these groups would argue that this pursuit ends with the removal of explicit legal barriers. Still, most would likely agree that over the long haul, legal obstacles to full and equal participation in American life tend to diminish. It was once possible to make a similar argument with respect to economic obstacles. As late as 1979, the prevailing view among economists was that incomes in any advanced industrial democracy would inevitably become more equal or remain stable in their distribution. They certainly wouldn't become more unequal. That sorry fate was reserved for societies at an earlier stage of development, or where the dictatorial powers of the state preserved privilege for the few at the expense of the many. In civilized, mature, and free nations, the gaps between rich, middle class, and poor did not increase. That seemed the logical lesson to draw from U.S. history. The country's transformation from an agrarian society to an industrial one during the late 19th and early 20th centuries had created a period of extreme economic inequality, one whose ramifications can still be glimpsed by, say, pairing a visit to George Vanderbilt's 125,000-acre Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina, with a trip to the Tenement Museum on Manhattan's Lower East Side. But from the early 1930s through the early 1970s, incomes became more equal and remained so, while the industrial economy lost none of its rude vitality. As the 1970s progressed and that vitality diminished, but income distribution remained as the 1970s progressed, that vitality diminished, but income distribution remained unchanged. Quote, as measured in the official data, unquote, the Princeton economist Alan Blinder wrote in 1980, quote, income inequality was just about the same in 1977 as it was in 1947, unquote. What Blinder couldn't know, because he didn't have more recent data, was that this was already beginning to change. Starting in 1979, incomes once again began to grow unequal. When the economy recovered in 1983, incomes grew even more unequal. They have continued growing more unequal to this day. So the inequality I'm talking about is the change, the negative change. I'm not talking so much about existing inequalities, which are powerful, and usually have legal components or historical legacies behind them. When the income trend that I'm mostly interested in is actually one where the historical legacy is kind of positive, where things were getting better, and then they started getting worse. It's really just sort of a question of the economy no longer functioning in quite the same way it used to, which is a different question from whether society is providing equality to all sorts of groups, including the disabled. I actually haven't looked at the question of whether the economic situation of the disabled has improved over the last 30 years. I would guess it has slightly, but I could be wrong. I don't know. I don't know how effective the actually, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I covered the passage of the Americans for Disabilities Act. I really don't know what impact it's had. You probably know a lot more about that than I do. But those are, equality is a big word, and it covers lots of different things. The equality I'm looking at is the kind of big brush income equality trend of the last 30 years. And to a small extent in the chapter I just read you from here, I'm also interested in the mobility question. Mostly because people offer up mobility as a reason not to be interested in income inequality. And in fact, the mobility, the United States wins no gold star when it comes to upward mobility, particularly with respect to African Americans. I mean, some of the most shocking statistics, I think that statistic I cited about the chances of a child moving up from the dead center of the economy if they were African American or white. I mean, that disparity is one of the most disturbing economic statistics I know. If you're in the middle class, you're just supposed to be middle class. And clearly that is not the case.
Question?
I have a kind of a naive question.
Do you,
It's
did she
okay not
need
to get
this?
it on tape. It's okay.
I'll bring it around. Take your time. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to getting your book. This isn't my field at all, which is my excuse for this being probably a very naive question. But when we speak of income inequality, what are the range of acceptable levels of inequality that economists, activists, scholars in this field have suggested we are tolerable? I suspect the argument is not that we should have no inequality at all, although that might be nice. But can you give us some idea of what we might be shooting for and what the debates about that are?
Let me invite you to think about it in a slightly different way. First of all, first principle, yes, we want some measure of income inequality in any society, and we want it because for capitalist economies appear to be the only ones that can actually create wealth, as far as we know. Not untrammeled capitalism, perhaps, often modified capitalism, as the United States system is. But to create wealth, you need to have some level of income inequality in order to reward skill and effort. That just is part of the story. So the question is not whether we should have some income inequality. We need some. The question is how much we need, and how much is too much, which I think is your question. And it's really an unanswerable question because inequality is, think of it as an economic indicator. When we look at the economy as a whole, it's hard to say that this or that number is the right number for this or that indicator. What you really want to look at is the whole thing kind of working right? The one thing we know is that when one indicator starts to go haywire, it's likely a symptom of trouble. And the income inequality indicator has been going haywire. We've seen. I'll be talking about this more tonight, but there are really two types of income inequality that are happening simultaneously. The 1% is increasing its share of all of the nation's income. It's doubled it since 1979. And we are also seeing a growing gap between incomes for people with college degrees and people who lack them. These two things are happening at the same time. A lot of argument about their relative importance and the role that higher education plays in them. I'll be addressing these questions tonight. But for now, what I would invite you to think is we don't know how much. I guess we'd like to have as little income inequality as we need in order to make a capitalist economy work. What we definitely don't want is to see that inequality grow and grow and grow. We know that we had a functioning economy, more than functioning, an economy that was functioning to an enviable degree after World War II, where we saw considerably less broad-based income inequality, again, talking about the entire country now, than we see today. So we know that we can have, and America was a very capitalist country in 1950. So we know we can make do with a lot less. Now the economy is different than it was back then. So maybe the magic percentage is higher than that now. Maybe it's lower. Who knows? We have a different economy. But what we do know is that to have this level, to have the degree of income inequality steadily and uncontrollably increasing is very worrisome. It seems to be a symptom that something is going wrong in the economy. And what do you know? Our economy is in fact not performing all that well. And that's before you get into all of the other discussion about why we should be concerned about excessive income inequality in the first place. And the short answer to that is it has all sorts of terrible effects on society, on democracy, and economists are starting to think it also has a bad effect in itself on the economy. There are a lot of people who are starting to believe that the growing degree of income inequality is holding back the recovery from this last recession, or alternatively has been a reason why the economy has been performing so poorly really since 2000. That's a long-winded answer to your question, but to get it down to a sentence, I don't know what the right amount of income inequality is, but I think it's very bad that we keep getting more and more and more.
Thank you. Just one more question,
Mm-hmm.
the predictable question, which is whether you address in your book, and I'm sorry I haven't bought it yet, but I am planning to, and read it too.
Mm-hmm.
Did you say anything about the role, because it strikes me that the current era of rising income inequality aligns really neatly with the era that many people refer to as the era of mass incarceration or hyper-incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
And do you explore the connections between those two in your book?
I don't know, and it's when you. I'm really a little bit out of my depth here, but I think when you are incarcerated, you are removed from the workforce, right? So the workforce data did not include incarcerated people. Obviously, if you did include incarcerated people, income inequality would be a whole lot worse. That's a rich topic that I know other people have looked at. I just don't happen to know the answer to that question. But the data I've been looking at does not count people who are incarcerated as part of the workforce. So and those data are bad enough.
The issue so much, but the issue would partly be the impact of income as it relates to people who are incarcerated, but it would also be the impact upon their families.
Right.
And
Opportunity costs, yeah. Yes. Right. Well, you could make a sick joke out of it and say when the economy declines, the opportunity costs also decline, which is not a very cheery thought. But yeah, there are opportunity costs there. I was just today, or just yesterday, reading a story about people who go to college, who have been, the college attendance has actually ticked up since the recession. And one sort of way of describing that is that the opportunity, when you go to college, the cost isn't just the cost of the tuition, it's also the opportunity cost of lost income being in the workforce. But that opportunity cost has declined. And that's partly what's pushing more people into college. People people aren't going to jail voluntarily, but again, it's the opportunity cost of being in jail has also gone down, although it still obviously exists. But again, I'm talking about a subject I haven't really studied very closely. It's an enormous topic unto itself.
Thank you so much. And then I've read your book yet, but I'm just wondering, regarding increasing income inequality, do you see any correlation between immigration policy and income, inequality? Because my hunch is that because now I'm writing a dissertation about Korean, international students, and then I found one interesting is that Korean government now trying to facilitate Korean society as more multicultural, society to secure cheap neighbors, cheap workers from other countries as like that. So I just wonder, the diversity of the U.S. society and that the population is. Do you think is there any relationship between the immigration policy and increasing the number of immigration and then consisting of income inequality?
No, I really don't think there is much of one. There is a. I understand why one would suspect the timing is just about perfect when you look at U.S. history. The U.S. liberalized its immigration laws in the mid-1960s, and kind of giving the growth in immigration a few years to really sort of gather steam, you think, well, income inequality starts taking off in 1979. It would be logical that would be driven by immigration, particularly undocumented immigration. But it doesn't appear to be true, and I rely chiefly here on the work of George Borjas, who's an economist at Harvard. And he's an interesting economist who's, to consider because he is very anti-immigration. And he has tried very hard to show that immigration has created income inequality. And because he is a very honest and rigorous economist, he has really not been able to show it. The best he's been able to do is to show that there has been some impact on one particular group within the United States, and that's high school dropouts. And even there, it's not overwhelming. And the reason that the impact has been largely confined, almost entirely confined to that group, is that these undocumented laborers coming from Mexico and Central America, mostly from Mexico, are very poorly educated. And so that is the labor market they're going into, principally, not entirely, but principally. So that's where the impact has been felt. Now, that's an unfortunate consequence, but it's a very limited consequence. And when you're looking at the growth of income inequality, you're really not looking at a trend that has a lot to do with the condition of the poor. The position of the poor relative to the middle class over the last 30 years has been relatively stable. There have been periods actually where we've seen a lot of improvement, particularly under Bill Clinton. There have been periods when we saw a decline under Ronald Reagan. And we saw a decline again after the recession. I don't know. I think that's finally stabilized. I'm not certain. But it's a line that goes up and down, and certainly the availability of social welfare has improved for that group. Where you see the change is for the middle class relative to the affluent. What I say in my book is it was always lousy to be poor. It was lousy in 1979. It's lousy today. It hasn't gotten appreciably more lousy. But it didn't used to be lousy to be middle class. It used to be a pretty good deal to be middle class in the United States. And that is where you've seen the meaningful decline, is the position of the middle class relative to the affluent. And immigration leaves that trend largely unaffected. If anything, stepping up immigration at the high end for highly skilled workers might tamp down income inequality to some extent. Although even that situation has gotten murky. There's been a lot of research that's kind of pointing in different directions about STEM workers and whether we have a shortage of them or not. And so in my book, I argued for granting more visas and saying that would. I'm actually less certain of that now that I've seen some of the subsequent research. But certainly, I think it's very hard to argue that immigration is increasing income inequality to any meaningful degree. The other thing to keep in mind is that while the United States is having a huge argument about immigration policy, undocumented immigration, which is the source of all the angst about this, has actually declined. And I keep waiting for the discussion to sort of catch up with that fact. It's declined largely, it seems, because of the improvement of the economy of Mexico. And this trend actually predates the recession. It may be that we will have partisan warfare over this issue that goes on for years until somebody looks up and says, you know what, while we were screaming and yelling about this, the problem kind of went away. Maybe that's an oversimplification, but it's always risky to predict the future. But certainly the trend of the last decade has been a decline in undocumented immigration.
I've got the mic here, so I get to ask a question, maybe even two. The first one's very uninteresting, so keep it short. Longitudinal studies are troublesome because the world behind the study doesn't stay the same. There are no farmers, so we can't have a farmer class. We have entrepreneurs and we have unemployed farmers. I mean, they aren't making anything other than bare living conditions. Yes, those exist, but they're not a 1/4 category for analysis of those data that you were speaking of.
You're talking about the Joseph Ferry data looking at the 19th century and turn of the 20th century, when he was measuring mobility according to occupation.
Yes. Well, I thought you were continuing to emphasize those on up through the years.
No, only that data, because there was no other data, and he massaged it heavily. And to tell you the truth, I am not enough of a expert in his methods to tell you how good or bad a job he did. It seems to be that that's kind of the best we can do given what we've got.
And would you say that it is better for the recent 20 years of studies for categorizing what it constitutes different classes or different income categories?
Yes, because it's done entirely based on income, which is to say it's not based on occupation at all. These studies that we started looking at starting in the early 1990s. It's comparing where somebody stands, where mom and dad stand in the income distribution to where their son or daughter stands in the income distribution. It's their relative position purely based on money.
You said that, and I failed to register it and kept thinking about no farmers.
And you can also obviously be a very rich farmer, and could back then too. So it was not these
Yes.
categories were not perfect. And the other thing I would add to that is that that kind of touches on the question of why you're looking at income and not wealth. And my short answer would be that when we went from being a largely agricultural economy to a largely industrial economy, we also went from being an economy where what mattered was wealth to an economy where what mattered was income. And interestingly, you see that in the fact that nobody even tracked income distribution in the United States until the Progressive era, because the Progressives were really the first left of center group in the United States that finally said, okay, we're not trying to eliminate the dark satanic factories. We recognize that they are going to be there, and that we're going to have an industrial society. And so the question, therefore, is how will this income, which is the basis now of our economy, be distributed?
Lovely. So, to Horatio Alger, the number one message, the number one learning that we've provided our children with in the last 20 years is that you're dumb. The tests show you that you aren't going to be able to move up. People in the lower half of the class aren't expecting that they're going to have any possibilities, opportunities, and the like. To me, one might say that education has really been successful in persuading people that they're not going to be able to move up the income or the opportunity ladder and the like. So, being once a testing person and now an anti-testing person, I'm wondering whether you see this message that's anti-Alger, Alger-Hiss, I almost said, Horatio Alger position is prominent, is the dominant view that our young people have today. Yes, those who speak out, go to rallies or go to Harvard, aren't going to say this, but the youngsters in Chicago are likely to say, it's not going to get better.
That's a really important point, and it gets to the question of whether how opportunity is structured in a meritocracy. People tend to forget that the word meritocracy was coined by an English sociologist who was making fun of the idea, and he saw it in the 1950s as leading to all sorts of disturbing trends. Not that he was any admirer of aristocracy as an alternative, but he thought that there were all sorts of problems with the idea of meritocracy, and many of them have come to pass. The meritocratic elite is more self-satisfied than the aristocratic elite ever was. The aristocratic elite at least understood that its good fortune was in large part an accident of birth. Today, the meritocratic elite feel entitled to a degree that is really unprecedented. And I think that's shaped a lot of our political thinking on this. that raises two questions. One question is our merit, are they really, our best and brightest? Are they really the people best able to perform these leadership roles in our economy? And that's open to serious question given all sorts of flaws in the way meritocracy works. Because for one thing, families didn't just go away when meritocracy came into being. Family ties remained very powerful. Parents continued to want to give the very best to their children, to think, in effect, I want my kids to have the same unfair advantages I had, and they've worked very hard to get them. There's a whole lengthy critique of the SAT in particular as a sorting mechanism. You're probably familiar with Nick Lemon's wonderful book, The Big Test, which is actually not just about the SAT, but about the whole structure of meritocracy in American society and where it goes awry. And then there's a question of, even if you could magically come up with a perfect meritocracy, where only the strong prevailed and the weak were systematically sorted out, how much of society's how much would you want to distribute the things that people need based on merit? Don't stupid people deserve health care as much as smart people? Don't bad people deserve health care as much as good people? The same could be said about earning a decent wage, about not being harassed by the police, about all sorts of things. There are some things that we want to distribute in our society based on merit, but there is a smug tendency to believe that everything should be based on merit. Used to be that you couldn't get a pension unless you were an executive. What was the logic behind that? Did people think that non-executives didn't retire? Pensions should not be distributed based on merit. Access to public parks should not be distributed on merit. Stupid people should get to go to parks, and smart people should get to go to parks. What does stupid and smart even mean? I mean, who knows? People are, my life experience has always told me that people's intelligence is highly variable, not only based on the particular situation. People have different kinds of gifts, many of which are not measured by tests, but even day to day. I have days when I'm smart and I have days when I'm stupid. I'm sure that's true of everybody in this room. And so these are all questions that tend to go unaddressed, and you don't see much writing about it. There was a not bad book by Chris Hayes that came out this past year called The Rise of the Meritocrats. I think he sort of overstated the case that meritocrats were responsible for destroying the economy. But it is certainly true that it was refreshing to see somebody write a book that said that meritocracy should not be seen as an innately good thing. It is a system of distributing societal goods that has certain advantages and certain disadvantages, and that ultimately we can't distribute societal goods based on any one thing, whether it be aristocracy or merit or anything. Some things just cry out for equality. The Constitution is very clear on that when it comes to legal rights. We all have equal access to free speech and sort of freedom of religion and so on. Why wouldn't that also be true in certain regarding the economy? In certain, not that everybody should make the same amount of money, but as I said before, we need a certain level of income inequality, but we need to constantly ask ourselves how much sort of how much more inequality are we tolerating than is necessary to have a successfully performing economy.
Oh, go ahead, Bob. You have another question?
You've spoken mostly about persons in your last 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Can we extend this to ideas? Can we extend this to corporations? There's a movement, we think, some of us think, to making corporations have the rights, and we might think of educational programs also having certain rights. And our commitment to saying evaluation should tell you which one should die and which one should live doesn't necessarily mean that their society benefits from that discrimination.
I'm old-fashioned. I think only people have rights. I don't think corporations have rights.
I do too. But we in the evaluation business are not thinking anything along the lines that you just described, whereby the diversity of ideas for education may be much better than having those that, what is the Reagan phrase? That's part of it. Anyway, the overemphasis on evaluation or what is best has its disadvantages along lines you've just described with regard to people. And that has to do with magazines and television. Like, we aren't tolerant of a diversity. We tend to have narrow criteria as to which ones should succeed, rather than an idea that it's a healthy society where bad ideas and good ideas live together happily.
Yeah, when it comes to diversity, my thinking on that is largely influenced by just practicality. I don't know if you read James Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds, which is a very good book, and he sort of talks about how societies make decisions. And he makes the point, which I think is obvious to a lot of people, wasn't obvious to me when I read it, but has since become so, that decision-making processes break down when the decision makers are not diverse, for the simple and obvious reason that they are not getting, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out. They are not getting a full picture of the reality that they are making decisions about. And so the real argument for diversity in all sorts of settings is that without it you make bad decisions, and that's going to cost you money. It's going to sort of lead to bad policies. In general, Surowiecki in his book says that crowds are actually a lot smarter than we think they are, but you can't just take a part of the crowd. You have to take in the full scope.
So earlier you made a comment that education can be a partial pathway out of income inequality. That brings to mind some of the student loan issues that revolve around higher education, especially like in professional schools such as law schools. And a lot of students coming out of school with over $100,000 in debt. What do you think that, can you talk a little bit about how that plays into the income inequality concept?
Yeah, I can't give you sort of facts and figures on that, but it does seem to me that we are rapidly approaching the moment when loans just aren't going to work as a form of student aid because the sums are too great. And it's just, it was a good idea for a while, but the underlying problem is the cost of college education is too high, and it has to come down. I think it will probably come down. But I've been very bad in the past predicting when it will come down. I wrote a piece about out-of-control college tuitions in 1983 for the Washington Monthly. And basically the message was, this can't continue. And in retrospect, I realize it was only getting started. I think since '83, the cost of college tuition has, in real terms, doubled. Now it's tricky because the value of a college education is very high, which is one reason why there hasn't been much downward pressure on colleges to curb tuition. But now that we're seeing the so-called college premium flatten, we're going to see a lot more pressure on colleges to tighten their belts. It's why you're seeing a rise in experiments involving sort of remote education, MOOCs, and so on. And I don't know where exactly it's going to lead, but I just don't think that when you're talking about sums like, I've got 2 kids in college right now, and the combined tuition is just $130,000. Now that's the sticker price, and I get a break, a financial aid break. But even with the financial aid break, it's just not practical, it seems to me, to address a problem like that, a cost like that, with loans. And to the extent that loans still work, it just doesn't seem likely to me that they're going to work for much longer.
I'm going to take the liberty of suggesting that this will be the last question because we're getting close to the time. But it really doesn't have to be. The part of your presentation in the book that's really fascinating is this myth persistence. And so I had several different sort of reactions to it. One is, did you dig deep enough to see where in the population segment the myth is strongest? And this is where I'm thinking about the myth of mobility and the endless mobility associated with American thought. I mean, how we continue to buy into that was what the different surveys show. And the sort of conspiracy notion, you could call it that when we look at the control of the airwaves, it's not just a reconcentration of wealth and the redistribution of income, but it's also the concentration of control over particular media forms, whether it's radio, television, but particularly those outlets, newspaper and print. So that seems to me a particularly volatile confluence to enable this myth to persist.
Yeah, I'm more skeptical of the idea that corporate concentration in the media has been a driving factor here. I think the more, I don't actually think that you would be seeing, let me put it another way. Fox News spouts a lot of ideology, fairly extreme right-wing ideology. And some of it I think Rupert Murdoch believes. I think quite a lot of it he doesn't believe. I think that what's driving that is not the ideological fervor of Rupert Murdoch. I think what's driving it is success in the marketplace. I think there's a lot of stuff on Fox News that probably embarrasses Murdoch. In fact, there have been some reports that suggest that. But he's making a lot of money because there seems to be a real market for this. Now, there are things that the government could do to rein that in. The main one being the fairness doctrine. You know, back in the 1960s, you didn't see Birchers on the CBS Evening News, because if they put a Bircher on, they would have to put a communist on to sort of balance them out, and they didn't want to do that. So I think it's less, I think that change is less a function of economic concentration than it is of deregulation. In retrospect, I think maybe it was a mistake to repeal the fairness doctrine, because the airwaves have become filled with a lot of very ideological pronouncement. Not all of it on the right, but there does seem to be an audience there, for a very large audience there, for right-wing extremism. I don't think it's a permanent audience. I think it's concentrated in sort of elderly, white, kind of resentful people who have also kind of fueled the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement is very heavily tilted towards the elderly. A lot of its members are retired, and I mean, it's sort of kind of an irony of the welfare state that the Social Security made it possible for sort of angry old people to denounce the welfare state. But you know, we're seeing a demographic shifts in America that I think drive a lot of this right-wing extremism. Those demographic shifts will eventually, I think, make that audience much smaller than it is today. And the other thing to remember is that the media reaches much further than it used to, and that has a lot to do with it. The John Birch Society, you know, back in the 60s, that there was no internet, so they, you know, they weren't in your face the way they are, the way their successors are today. Cable news, you know, has created a niche market that, you know, Walter Cronkite couldn't have made it on the ratings that Fox News gets. He would have gone out of business. But that's a niche market. It's a big niche market, but it's still a niche market. And so I would say that a lot of that is, you know, these are folks who were always there. They're more visible now because of technology, the angry right is becoming irrelevant, and that's I think driving its politics, is that sort of fury of becoming irrelevant. But I think if you had less economic concentration, I don't think it would be terribly different. Maybe I'm wrong about that. You know, maybe you could have more diversity if you had more outlets. But to tell you the truth, I mean, you've got a lot of diversity within these media conglomerates already. I mean, the newspaper editorial, I think, is I don't think newspapers should run editorials anymore, because they used to be, here are the views of the publisher, the local publisher, about what's going on. Well, today you've got the Tribune Company spouting one set of opinions here in Chicago and an entirely different set of opinions in Los Angeles. It's completely artificial. And in fact, the Tribune Company doesn't have any political positions at all. It has one editor who says certain things in Chicago and another editor who says certain things in Los Angeles. And it's driven, to the extent that it's driven by the market at all, it's driven by kind of locally based prevailing opinions. So you've already, you know, within the Tribune Company, you've already got a certain amount of diversity. Would you get more if those two newspapers were owned by separate folks? I don't know. I don't think so necessarily. And the internet, meanwhile, has also brought us a lot of diversity. In some cases, too much diversity. In some cases, the nut fringe has a much bigger megaphone than it used to have. Sometimes I sort of feel like, be careful what you wish for. You just might get it.
Questions?
Always have something. Well, not question. I just wanted to thank you for coming today and just sharing some additional light on the subject of income mobility. And I know, like I said, it's just really something that's really become a true interest of mine. I really never I'm an attorney and a doc student, so I really never focused on a lot of this. But in the coming years, if you look at my current family situation, it's really impacted my family. I'm the youngest of 12, but my parents moved from Tennessee in the 1940s. And so they had 12 kids, and out of their 12 kids, a father only having a 4th grade education and my mom never graduating from high school, they were able to come to Chicago and at some point in the early 60s purchase a home. And by the time I was born in 75, they were middle-class Americans and eventually moved to Oak Park, where I ended up getting my education. Fortunately. However, I'm looking at my family, I got 6 siblings with, college degrees. 6 of us have college degrees, 3 have beyond a bachelor's degree, and our middle majority, 12, well, with the exception of 2, are middle class or upper middle class at this point, but my 60-something nieces and nephews I'm really concerned about them because we're between, when I'm looking at income mobility, what you're saying is completely my family. They're not doing as well as my siblings. And then now that my nieces and nephews are of college age or they're graduating from high school, out of 60-something kids right now, we have like 1 that's in a full-time 4-year school because no one can afford to go to college. And so it saddens me because, my parents stressed the importance of education with their kids and figured that's how they would, leaving the country to come here for better opportunities. Now we have a situation where they got their kids in middle class America, but now we can't get the grandkids out of, living with parents. Many of them are living with their parents or in roommate situations. All of them are working, but it's like they want to go to school, but they can't afford to go to school. Student loans, you only get like $2,000 and something, and then if you don't qualify for, your parents can't take out a loan, then you get an additional $4,000, so you're like at $6,000. With the law changing last year to where students not eligible for Illinois, is it MAP grant? The MAP grant. A lot of students didn't know that their parents had to file financial aid before, I think it's January 15th. There was some deadline that they had to file, get their financial FAFSA forms in, but if they didn't get their FAFSA forms in, they were not considered for an Illinois grant. So a lot of family members did not get Illinois grant this year because some families are not able to file their income taxes as early so that students can get the FAFSA. It's just been a complete mess.
Right.
So I'm just really, really getting concerned about this coming from a family where now I have 60-something nieces and nephews and like 50-something grandnieces and nephews. And as an attorney / doc student / sort of leader of the family, they're turning to me for help and questions and assistance on how to make it. And I attempt to assist them, but it's like sometimes I just don't have the answers because I push education, but unfortunately a lot of them can't afford it. So I'm just really trying to figure out where this is going, and it's scary to me.
It's very scary. It's very scary, and that's why when I was talking about that statistic about the sort of likelihood of moving up if you're sort of dead center, it just goes against everything I feel like I was taught when I was growing up. I mean, I I feel like the message was that once you get into the middle class, you shout "Ali Ali oxen free." You have made it. You have. It's a very difficult journey to get there, but you get there, and life is supposed to be good. And to learn that once you're there, if you're African American, the likelihood that if you're in that particular middle quintile, the likelihood that your children will move down the income scale exceeds the likelihood that they'll go. That's just not the way it's supposed to be. It's very troubling, and I don't know what the answer is. But when I talk about the growing income inequality, I talk about a lot of the things that don't contribute to it, and one of the things that actually doesn't contribute to the Great Divergence in a direct way is race. Even though you would think it would, because when we think of equality, the first thing we usually think of is race. And the answer is that when you look at the income gap between whites and blacks, it hasn't changed since 1979. So it can't be contributing directly to the growth in income inequality. Now, a couple of people have pointed out to me since I wrote my book that it certainly has contributed indirectly in the sense that Americans turning against the idea of social welfare. It's no coincidence that that happened at the dawn of the civil rights era. A lot of sort of government, sort of society's revulsion of government reflects ugly racial views. But directly, that income gap hasn't increased income inequality. Now, whenever I say that, I always have to stop and say something else, which is, let's go in a time machine, go back to 1979, and I'm going to tell you that a third of a century from now, the income gap between blacks and whites will not have narrowed. You would tell me I was out of my freaking mind. That gap was not deemed remotely acceptable in 1979, and there was every reason to believe that we would see improvements. And we haven't. And so the fact that we haven't is a huge problem in our society. So yes, it's true that that gap hasn't contributed greatly to income inequality, but that fact in and of itself speaks of enormous failure on the part of our society. And not, even a cynic back in 1975 would never have guessed that to be possible, given the changes that we were seeing. I mean, the income gains that African Americans made relative to whites are front-loaded when you look at the data. It all happened in the 60s and 70s, and then the income gains just stopped.